Thank you, Naja and the team, Daniel, for inviting me here. This is my first talk at least this year, 2021. So hopefully we all have a great 2021 ahead of us. And yeah, a few things about the topic, like we'll have to discuss what provider is and how you can use it for your Flutter applications and some concepts behind state management, especially the things that are revolving around Flutter. And a few things about me. As mentioned by Daniel, I'm a Google developer expert for Flutter and Dart. I'm currently based in the Philippines, and I'm a software engineer for a company based in the US. So some of the things we'll be discussing today, definitely understanding what a state is, what a state management is, how it relates to a state, and why is it important, especially for you guys that are still in college and you plan to work for a company or a real in the industry after you graduated in college. Why is state management important? The challenges, at least the two most faced challenges whenever you're trying to implement state management in Flutter. What is provider? What are the APIs that you will be needing and how you can use it, guided by some of the practical examples that we'll be having. So let's just try to revisit some of the things that probably, especially if you are in college, then definitely you can relate to this. So imagine the time that your teacher is asking to build an application. And oftentimes, if not all of the time, he or she will be asking the details in form of mock-ups. So the data, the tiny bits of information that you see in an application. So this example, a chart, different charts that you can show in your application. These, if not all of the times, refer to the information or the data that you want to show in your application, which in turn refers to the state of your application. And oftentimes at core, every time if you're building a Flutter app or whether you're building on a different platform, most of the time you'll be building an application that deals with state, especially if it's a content driven, if it's a dynamic application, you will have to deal with state. So that's the fact in the industry. So without too much complexity, data is just, like the information or the data that describes how your app would look like to your users, what the details can be shown or state, whether the user is logged out or logged in, what specific screens you should be able to show him or show her in a specific moment that he is trying or she's trying to use your app. Next, the state can be represented whether in a simple Boolean. So Boolean can probably something like is logged in. So that's a simple data type that you can use, or even a complex object. So you can have a list of objects. You can have a list of ever-changing objects. So for example, you have a to-do list, then this changes based on some user input or derived state, and so on. And last but not the least, the state should be managed properly. Otherwise, you'll have some unwanted user experience for your application and the user of your app. So it will be considered as a bug sometimes because it does not follow the design spec or the product spec that you're building. And some of the things, like on top of everything about state, this is just an example of an Uber app where the different states in it. So as you can see in the industry, if you're actually working in a real solid application, you will have to deal with a lot of states, especially in software. So this is just an example of the different single flow that we'll have to deal with different state depending whether it's the user is online or offline, and a lot more derived state on top of it. And what's the difference between state management and state? Well, state management is just the technique or the process to handle state of your application. So it's just a verb. It's not something complex definition. It's just the action that you put into your application so that you'll be able to handle all the state or the data in your app. And state can be categorized into two major groups. So the first one is local state. So local state, this can either be a state within a specific widget, within a specific screen, or within a specific feature scope. So these are all based on your team's decision for the feature scope, how you can identify a specific state as local or global, at least for the feature scope. But on the other hand, global state is just the counterpart of local state. In global state, that feature scope state that we're talking about, this can now be shared with other domains or other features of your application. So that's just two category of state in Flutter or state in general. Most of the times I recommend my students to just, if they can architecture the app, especially if you have an enormous amount of timeline, try to reduce, not as much as possible, the reliance on global states, because it will not help you in the long run. And especially if you're working with a lot of team members, they can introduce a lot of side effects that you may not be aware of, especially if you're just trying to change a tiny bit of the code that you're trying to work on. And on top of all the things that we've learned, global state, state management, why should someone, especially you, students, should learn state management? Well, if you're already in the industry, most, if not all, of the apps are content driven, dynamic, and ever changing. Ever changing in a way that things can be improved, things can be replaced by latest features that is available to the hardware or even to the software updates user or device has. And if you are here not to ask me what's the best state management, because I'm already working in the industry, so maybe I should know what's the best state management. Well, there's no such thing. So I'd like to reiterate on that one. There's no such thing. And to be honest, like, this is probably the most asked question in the community. Just recommend, especially if you're just starting to use Flutter, don't be overwhelmed by the state management that you see, or the tools, the architectures, the packages that you see in the pub.dev, but rather just start small, start simple. If your app can be built using set state, using provider, then just start building the app. Because in the end, one of the things that we have to learn as engineers is we are building something rather than trying to make something that no one's ever going to use. So just try to think that. Don't be afraid, because even if there's are too many state management, just try to start small on that specific question. And the challenges. So you have learned what state is, you've learned what state management is. Let's try to see what are the two most faced challenge in managing state for Flutter. So the first one is separating business logic from the UI. So this is common. So if you're not aware in Flutter, if you're probably familiar already with the counter app, then you'll probably remember that there's a function called increment counter. So one of the examples that we have here is that we can check whether the user is logged in within the specific homepage, whether we can check all the details that we need for that specific widget that we have in the homepage, and other details from the API. Although we can do this, really, especially if you're working on a hackathon project, prototype, POC application, it simply doesn't scale, all right? So this is okay for a small app, but on a big application, this wouldn't be practical, because you'll have to work with a lot of team members in the engineering team. And one of the things that you have to understand as well is that you should refrain from doing something like this. So for example, we have two pages. We have homepage and we have settings page. So unlike imperative languages such as languages and frameworks such as Swift for iOS, Java, Kotlin for Android, you can see here that you can actually do something like this. So probably you want to define a specific function in the homepage to determine whether the user is logged in or not, because it holds the reference, or you want to call a function from other widgets because it already has the value. Why should I pass it as a constructor if I can just call the instance of that specific value? Well, you can do something like this, but this is not ideal, especially if they don't rely or they're not part of the same context. Because what if the homepage was accidentally disposed? What if the homepage was accidentally removed from the widget tree? Then this gets invalidated. So that's something that you have to consider, especially if Flutter is declarative and this is how things are being rendered and being displayed in your application. And as mentioned earlier, if you try to put everything, the business logic of your application in your UI, it just simply doesn't scale. There are a lot of factors to it, but I just want to tell you that putting everything in the UI, business logic, API calls, simply doesn't scale, allow you to scale an application. And if you're not aware how your code works, like since you called it within a specific widget and it gets disposed, you'll have a hard time, like debugging the issues, because testing is really difficult, especially if you try to add everything in the UI. So instead of you trying to create a small set of tests, such as the unit test, if you add everything in the UI, you will not be able to do something like that easily. Although it's possible, it's not that easy to test applications with all the business logic added in the UI. So the first challenge is separating business logic from the UI. Next challenge that we have to understand for state management is exposing an instance or a value of an object. So this refers to if that specific value is already available from the dashboard, how can I retrieve it from home or settings? Because it already exists. Why should I fetch it again from the API? So one of the basic ways of passing the value of an existing object or instance is from using constructor. So hopefully you guys are already aware how constructor works. So in a constructor, you just expose a value parameter. Then the parent widget, in this case is my app, just tries to pass the value to the home page. Okay, and this home page now will have to react whether it is logged in or it is logged out. So right now we're trying to pass the value whether the user is logged in or logged out from the material app, which is the top or the root widget in your application. And in constructor, oftentimes you'll see a lot of these in a Flutter application. So this just exposes a parameter whether this is logged in or not. And in the widget, in the home page, we can decide whether to show the user if the user is logged in or logged out. So this is very straightforward. We're just dealing with the value. So widget is logged in. So this is coming from the my app, passed to the homepage constructor. Then we'll just show welcome Joshua. But if it's not logged in, then we'll just show no user is logged in on that specific app. Although constructor works, especially on that use case, what if it gets complex? So probably you have a dashboard now that has 2 subpages. Well, I think it's still working. You can still manage it in the long run, but I assume most of you are not dreaming of this kind of simple application. Most of you are planning to build and have a goal of building a complex application. And this may look something like this, right? So if you're building a real app, you'll always have to deal with a lot of values, a lot of data, and a lot of screens. As a good application, especially apps like Facebook, Twitter, they have several screens and multiple data that can be displayed or be rendered on your application. And this is something that you might not be able to scale as well, because there are a lot of things that you have to take into consideration here. How can we overcome the 2 challenges that we have? Separating the business logic from the UI and passing the value or object by reference, especially in Flutter. Well, we use different tools and architectures or packages, whatever you may call it, so as long as a way for managing the state. These helps provide you some set of APIs or methods that can allow you to manage state easily in Flutter. So one of the most common things that you can do is set state. It abstracts like notifier within your specific state object, and it notifies the framework whenever you try to call this function, and the specific value will be changed, and your UI will react appropriately based on the data that has been changed. So I assume most of you are already familiar with that one, especially if you have built the counter app. Next one is we have the scope model and provider, but oftentimes most of us will be using provider, especially if it's just a simple application. But if you're building, or especially if you're working with a large team, you'll now have to start looking for something, state management tool that has to deal with or has to help you with the architecture or how you can abstract or modularize different features of your app. So this can be Mobex. Personally, we use Mobex in our company, Block, Redux, and you can see a lot more approaches that the end of this talk. I'll provide you the link. And there's a simple rule. If you're in doubt, just use provider. If you're not sure of all the things that I mentioned here, just use provider, because there's nothing wrong by starting small starting using provider. Since we are now leaning towards our way to learn what provider is, these are just some of the things that you have to understand how provider works and what provider really is. So going back to our example earlier, that we have to open a lot of constructors for home, for settings. These can be trivial because you have to open a lot of parameters and a lot of variables if you're just trying to get this is login value on these two pages. And if dashboard doesn't need it, then it's really useless, right? You're just opening a constructor in dashboard because you want to pass it on settings or home. So the solution for that one is maybe using inherited widget or provider. So the value from the My App is logged in can now be directly accessed within homepage widget. So as long as it's part of the context, so I'm assuming most of you have already seen the build context in the Counter app. So that's how you can determine if this homepage is part of this navigation or this route, especially of this root widget. So as long as it's part of the same context in the build method, then they can be logged in directly in the homepage without you having to open a constructor in the specific widget, which saves you a lot of time. What if you have a lot of widgets already underneath the provider? Then you can just do something like this instead of passing everything in dashboard and just using something what you need on that specific page. And in our example app later, I'll be showing you the source code later. We'll try to build it as well. This is just the kind of like high level view architecture of the app. So it has different view models. Later we'll see them in action. What are the methods included in them? And if you try to add a new item in the cart, we will call the method add item, and this will notify the My App that also subscribes to the cart view model, which is a provider class or change notifier class, and this publish all the changes to the widgets that needs it. So for example, since I'm subscribing to cart view model here and cart view model here, this also gets changed. But if I'm not subscribing for the value change in the cart view model, in dashboard or history, the shop will be the only one that will change or will receive the latest value. So again, if we try to change something within the specific change notify class, the root widget will get notified with the latest changes, and it will publish all the changes to the child widget. So it's a bit straightforward. We just have to call the method. We have to notify all the subscribers and render the changes. Provider in a context, what you see earlier is the inherited widget where you can access is logged in directly from My App to the homepage. That's inherited widget, but provider is a wrapper, meaning it simplifies everything for you so that you'll be able to use it. It's very simple. It uses simple methods and API. Later you'll see them in action. Because if we are still using inherited widgets, this is how it would look like. So it's a bit verbose because you have to add a couple of these lines always in your code whenever you're trying to create a view model or business logic part of your app. Next is provider is kind of like a mixture between state management and DI, and it allows you to provide like dependency injection. It allows you to provide existing instance of an object down to the widget tree. So you will also see them in action later. And last but not least is by just using provider without over engineering things, you can really scale your application, even publish an application that works and can be used by a lot of users. So as long as the UI is separated and you have a lot of awesome tests written. Okay, we'll try to determine the steps on how you can create a provider class or how you can implement provider in your application. Well, the first step is to really just have to identify what are the objects or values that we have to provide down the widget tree. So if you're thinking with Flutter you're just thinking like Flutter is built on trees. So there are root widget trees, there are child widget trees. So think of the objects or the details that you have to pass from your parent to your children widgets. So this can either be, imagine if you have a API service or if you have Firebase, and there will be a lot of screens. Now, homepage, settings, history page, they will all be using Firebase instance or object value. Then they can use the same you can just simply provide an existing value on the top widget, and with the different childs that needs it, they can just simply retrieve it, right? So this one, we're just providing a user view model because this will be used across the entire app. Imagine you have authentication everywhere, then you really need it. We also have like the next step, which is to retrieve. Since you already provided it, what's the point of providing if you're not retrieving it? So just have to retrieve the value. So earlier you've seen the inherited widget, it's a bit verbose. In provider, you will just do something like this. So it's a bit shorter. It's single line, provider.auth, and the class. So this is the class. So the user view model, and you will just try to pass the context. So as long as it's part of the so as long as it's part of the context, then they should be retrieved successfully because it is already provided from the widget tree. You can simply use it on the child widgets. Last but not least is you have to determine, as just like the things that we mentioned earlier with regards to state acts as a deciding factor, what to show or what not to show to your user. So in this specific case, we will just be using the user model if it's logged in or not. So if it's logged in, then we'll just show this widget. If it's not logged in, then we'll just show this text that you are logged out. And one of the things that you have to remember is that I try not to recommend this specific use case. So imagine like false is one of the data types, default data types that we have in Flutter, and the value is very common. It's either true or false. And if you try to retrieve it, like bool, there can be a lot of bool provided. So this can either be provided by separate widgets that is a parent of this specific widget that we're trying to access. So as much as possible, try to refrain from using the default values or the default primitive data types that we have in Flutter, but instead create something like a user view model. So user view models is unique because you have created it for your specific application, which is not something available out of the box from Flutter. And this can be confusing for provider as well because there can be a lot of bool values provided at different places of your application. So as much as possible, create a class. And in a while, we'll see how you can actually create one. So in this live coding session, we will just create really something from scratch. We'll understand the different APIs such as the change notifier, provider, consumers, and selectors. So let me know if you have questions right now or if you want to clear up something. Right, so let me just desktop. Can you guys see my screen? I think hopefully it's a bit large enough.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just try to create an app. So hopefully, last year, you still remember from the workshop that you had with other speakers. You hopefully still remember the Flutter create method, and this is how you create Flutter applications from scratch. And the default app that comes out from this one is the most favorite app of all time, which is the counter app. Okay, let's just wait for it to finish executing. So it's still running. It's a bit hot here. But yeah, let's try to open the Flutter app. Hopefully it will open here. Okay. So by the way, later, this will be the application that we're trying to build. This is upon between Lazada and Shopee. So if you try to select an item from this specific shop list, as you can see here, there are things that reacts to these changes. So the first one is that it changes the cart item, and you can also change here, and this also changes. So those are kind of the examples of the global state that you can share across the app. You can also add other items, and this accounts the total 5, which is 5 here as well. And you can remove an item, and this should remove the count here as well. If you have to confirm it, we should just see the orders here. So I ordered 2 Nintendo Switch, and they should be there. Okay, this is the counter app. Okay, let's just try to. Okay, hope you guys can still see it. Oops, too much. Okay, and as always, next method that you have to understand or have to remember is the flutter run command. So flutter run I'll just run it. So currently, I'm using an iOS simulator, but one of the benefits of using Flutter is you can also deploy it on an Android app or Android device. Let me just grab my water. It's not here for some reason. So it's still running. Do you guys have any questions so far? Like, I'm happy to entertain if you have any. I'm using Firebase auth to keep track of the login status. However, sometimes when the user is logged in, okay, so there's a question. I'm using Firebase auth to log in the user using provider to keep track of the login status. However, sometimes when the user is logged in, the debug console returns user is equal to null related to the error first. After that, everything works fine. May know why this is happening and how to fix it. Well, this is really specific probably to how you code your application, but maybe you should try isolating first the issue. So if you have other things that updates the view model, maybe you can try removing them first, then just try to isolate the issue first for that login status. So one of the first things that I really do every time there's a bug and it involves authentication is isolating the issue from everything else that changes that specific provider. But really, this is not specific to your use case and not to provider, but yeah, one of the tips that I can give you is to try to isolate the issue first. So it's still running, but definitely there's no known issue so far. There's known issue between provider and Firebase, so you should be able to debug it properly. So probably that happens because, right? So as much as possible, try to provide the object or the instance of the provider, the change notifier on the root widget tree. So maybe you're trying to provide the widget or the provider within login page and it gets disposed. So maybe, yeah, we can also talk offline after this one if you like. Okay, so this is the counter app. Like, this is probably the most basic app that we can have or demonstrate how you can convert an existing Flutter app to an app that uses provider. So this is very basic. As you can see with the code, this is just really doing its basic function of every time you try to press something, it increments the counter. And for this method, it just calls the set state, which in turn, the counter is being updated. And since this is updated, you can see the changes as well reflected here. So, as part of the steps, how you can introduce provider to your app is to head on of that dev and look at this package called provider. So we'll just have to copy the latest version. So hopefully there's no breaking API at the moment. So this is how you add dependencies in Flutter. You'll just head over to your podspec.yaml. Under the Cupertino icons, just paste provider. And if you have the extension, if you're on VS Code, this should automatically be fetched. Otherwise, you have to run the command flutter packages get. Okay. Okay, right now we already have one. Okay, so this is our first activity. So hopefully if you guys want to follow, then feel free to create a Flutter app from scratch because we'll be doing everything from scratch in this activity. So our goal here is to separate the function increment counter from this homepage. Okay, so one thing that we have to remember are the steps. So one of the first steps is to create an object that you want to provide down the widget tree. So in here, I want to create a view model for the counter value. All right. And this, as mentioned earlier, instead of trying to rely on the default or primitive values that you want to provide, you can create custom classes. So that will allow you to even more handle this different state that is part of your application. Extends, change notifier. This is the default. And the change I can't see it from this import. Okay, import successfully. And this is the first class that we have to create. Next is we have to provide this class. So right now, this is just staying here, but it hasn't been used. So this is probably related to your issue. Yeah, I'll get back to your questions, guys, in a while. Let's just try to go back here. A multi-provider. So this is probably one of the most common class that you'll be using in provider. So multi-provider meaning you can have a series of providers inside your application. This is global, by the way. This is on top of the navigation, so meaning every screen of your application can use this value. So to provide the value, we already have the object, which is the counter view model. This is where we will add all the business logic of our application, and this is where we'll try to separate all the business of our logic of our application. So I'm just trying to reiterate that because like most of the times, really, if you're trying to build an application, it's best if you can separate the concerns of the UI from the domain. So to provide it, you will use a special class called change notifier provider. And since we are extending change notifier on this class, we will have to use the change notifier provider. Other class, you can use a default provider. So right now, it's already created. The instance is already created here. The next step, first is to provide a value. Next step is to use the value of an object. So where should we use it? In the home page. So in the home page, we can have something like this: final provider off. You can also add this on did change dependencies if you have extra business logic to render. So just using the simple API provider dot off, we can reference the counter view model. So for the counter view model, what it does is provider of counter view model, it instructs the provider that the homepage will listen to whatever value is being changed in this specific class. So that's what the provider dot off does. So in this example, instead of us trying to rely on the local counter, we can just simply remove it. We can just remove the function for now. We can have something like this, counter. So this is counter view model, so that it's a bit clearer for you guys. Counter.view model that right now it doesn't have any value because we haven't added any. So part of the second step that we have to use a provider is to just do something with the provider. So since this is int counter 0, right now we'll just use counter 0. Okay, that is perfect. Right now it doesn't change anything in the screen, so it's a bit boring. But since we already know that the counter view model will contain the logic of your application instead of this specific screen, earlier we have increment function here, we will now migrate the function increment counter here. Counter, and it's almost similar to the function that we have earlier, except we have this special method that we will have to call notify listeners. So right now we're not calling set state, but we are calling notify listeners. And as mentioned in this specific line, is that whenever this specific homepage calls this, it registers itself as a listener. So whenever the counter value changes, this build method gets rebuilt. Again, whenever we try to retrieve a value or register for a provider, especially on this class, we register this class to listen to the changes of this value, of this instance or value. And then we can also interact with that specific instance. So in this case, we have counter view model, and we can interact with it by calling its function counter view model dot increment counter. So in this case, we are calling a method coming from the counter view model. So let's try to see if our app works. So let's try to refresh. It works, like without us having to, like add the functions within the widget tree. We can now separate other functions. Not just by following that simple example, we can now separate other concerns, like as mentioned earlier by some of our friends here, the Firebase API, the other API calls that you may have in your app, whether it's Firebase or not, the GraphQL, REST API, you can put in them all here. So the counter view model, this is just a kind of like a convention that I follow if I try to build small apps. But oftentimes, like, you have to name your view model or model depending on the team's preference, and you have to create either one per page or one per widget depending on the complexity. So that's it. We separated the business logic from the UI. Now, without too much of a hassle, we're just creating a simple class. The only thing special about here is that we call notify listeners. We provided the instance here, and we retrieve and subscribe this homepage, register this homepage as a listener. So nothing special about it. Everything are just plain old Dart objects. Okay, we're already building, providing the instance down the widget tree. Next thing we have to consider is having granular rebuilds. So this is just a simple app. Like, it doesn't really have to follow some granular rebuilds, but if you're working on a real application that, for example, like displays a complex set of objects such as images, video, you don't want to rebuild the entire screen because some values has to change. There can be, provided it allows you to have granular rebuilds. So we'll have to disable this first. First, let's just try to move this. This can also be, let's just have it here since we already started having it here. So this provider has this method called listen, and or parameter called listen, and you can disable it. So whenever there are changes in this counter view model, even if you're registered as a listener, the build method will not be called. And to prove that, we will just have to call, hey, I am called. So right now we'll just uncomment the listen to false to prove that this is actually printing. Every time we tap this one. So this is called 2. This is called again. And that's what provider does to your application. But if we try to disable the way we subscribe or register ourselves to the counter view model, if we try to tap plus to rebuild, let me just try. Okay, I have restarted. Right now it's not rebuilding because we register this provider, but we are not interested on listening to the changes. So that's what this listen is all about. But how can we actually listen to the value changes on the specific widgets? Meaning we are just interested on changing this or rendering this specific object, but not the entire screen. Well, we have this API called from provider called consumer. So with consumer, we can do granular rebuilds. Value, child, we can copy. So this is, everything is on the docs, and you can also see it on the examples I'll be providing. But just for you to remember, consumer is part of the provider package that allows you to do granular rebuilds, meaning only specific part, like granule, only specific part of your application will have to change. So in this part, we'll just cut it again and return. Let's see if this is actually working. Value. So this is consumer dynamic. So Flutter provider does not allow that. We have to explicitly add counter view model. Okay. Right now it's rendering, but as you can see, the "Hey, I am cold" print line is not cold, meaning only this specific widget, the ones that you can see changing, is the one rebuilding. So to prove that, we can just use the print object. Now, like, "Hey, I am called inside these texts." Okay, and if we try to call that, okay, these changes, and as you can see here, it's only called in the specific builder method. Other screens, parts of your app are not re-rendering if they don't need to. Okay, although again, in a counter app, this may be too much since we only have simple widgets. On a complex application, you'll probably want to have some granular rebuilds, especially if the widgets deals with a lot of complex widgets such as image, video, and you don't want to re-render them again and again by just, even if the counter is just the one changing over time. Okay, that's for our first activity. Hopefully you guys have some question coming. If there's a WebSocket running toward REST API, could you automatically trigger a render? Definitely. You can trigger the API by just adding it here. And if there's an update from the API, you can just simply call notify listeners. So for example, you call subscribes to a stream provider, you can do it as well. So definitely, you can do it. But one of the things that I can recommend you, instead of using this plain old change notifier, maybe you can use the stream provider. So there's an API as well for that one. So I think it's also available from the Flutter provider package. So this is probably what you want to use on a WebSocket, since the difference between a feature and a stream is that feature are things that you probably want to call once in your app, but streams are open line communication. Like these are things that just come in indefinitely and you don't have no explicit way to end the connection between them. Okay, so for the next example, like that's for the last and second example is that we'll just try to tinker the builder app or the e-commerce app that we will have to build. So let me just close this one and let me open from terminal. Okay, let me just have some hack here. Hopefully you guys have some questions. Keep them coming. I'm happy to answer them in a few. And if it's something specific, I'll provide the contact info. Okay, let me try to see if this is the one. So what you have learned so far is how to use provider in the basic way possible if you try to convert. So let's try to see what it looks like on a hopefully complex app for you guys. Let me try to, is this the coding flow? Okay, this is my coding flow. Let me try to open. It's not opening for some reason. Okay. And we have it here. Okay, let's just try to run the app. I think there's an issue running the app because I have deleted some items. Or we can just simply comment them for now. Return container and comment next. So next, we will just have to run again. So let me just get back to some of your question. Since we're waiting for it does want to run, P sample version. This has 4 apps in it, but I want to just run the shop app. So you can also do it in Flutter. It's launching. I will get back to your question. I'm having a problem using provider with route. Always get an error that provider is scoped. When I initialize my provider to top of the widget tree, how can I solve this issue by research online? Yeah, this is again another probably specific use case. Maybe you guys can create a gist and you can share it privately with my GitHub account. I'll help you out. So this is rather a specific issue with your app. But at the back of my head, like providers are automatically just get disposed, especially if they're just part of a feature scope. So if that specific route gets disposed, and as you mentioned, if it's not part of the root widget tree, they will also get disposed. And if you try to use it, you will read an error from your console. But as you mentioned, like you initialize your provider at the top of your widget tree, yeah, we'll have to see it. No, like feel free to reach out to me on this one. Okay, if you guys have personal questions. Okay, this is running. Yeah, sure thing. Like for specific tree, you can also share it here, but yeah, like we can also have it offline so that others will have to, yeah, subscribe to this workshop. Okay, so for this one, like as you can see here, like we have nothing, but like earlier the version of the app, you can see there are list of items. And one thing that we can do in this activity is we can handle business logic, the complex ones, especially the ones that deal with API calls. Although, like I mentioned, that this is a complex object, I'll just try to copy, like a list of items is not actually from the API, but the point is you can call an API within the specific view model. So there may be some network issues, so I prepared local items that you can retrieve. So this is the PS5 console, the Switch. Hopefully we can get the PS5 here in Asia already. And yeah, like that's just about it. So imagine as if this is a method that calls the API. So this can either be converted to an async with a feature that calls a repository service. But this is, I promise you, this is almost similar. Like you can just simply add a function that is responsible for getting a function or getting a data from the network, and it functions as a way to update the shop items. So right now, the shop items initially, if you try to provide the shop view model, is empty. So this is an empty shop view items. But since we have this mock API call, we can just simply assign the mock items. So imagine as if these are all coming from the APIs and assign them to the shop items. So right now, even if we try to restart the app, it simply won't work. Okay? Because we haven't displayed it inside the shop, right? So for the shop, let's try to see it here. We have to create children for the shop. Right now, it just shows nothing because we have just commented the line. Okay. What I did here is just I added a child for the page view. So page view is kind of like allows you to have sub pages within a specific widget in Flutter. So I removed it earlier. But yes, this time we should now be subscribing. Right now, the shop items is empty. So again, as mentioned earlier, you just have to provide the value. So this is the class, shop view model. And the next step, like one of our first steps is to really just have to provide the value. This one is the shop view model. It's not part of the root widget tree, as you can say, as you can see it, like it's just part of the dashboard page, but it's not provided on the app or root app page. Meaning, if you try to access it inside a history page, later you'll see that there will be an error to it. So right now, we are seeing no shop items found because indeed the items or list of items is empty. So what we can do here is to just call the method fake API call. So that assigns the value of the shop items to the things that we are actually interested in. So this is one of the most easiest way to actually call an API in a Flutter app. Just have to add the function inside a view model, and you have to call it inside the page or widget. Then this will just re-render itself. As you can see here, we are just subscribing to the shop view model, meaning whenever this item gets called, the shop view model gets changed, the shop items, and it notifies the listeners. So right now, the only listeners that we have, or the only listener that we have, is the shop page, which is this one. The history page is not a listener of that specific view model. As you can see it in the architecture, the shop view model is only provided on this level. Okay, so that's how now you would typically have to call an API. Just have to create a function, create a service here that calls an API. Right now, we're just using mock items because there might be some network issues, live coding, but it's a bit straightforward. Just have to separate the business logic. Next thing is to provide feature level scope for the object. So as mentioned earlier, like the scope of the shop view model is only accessible inside the shop page. So if we try to create the a shop history, and let's try to run it. So we should have a shop history page here, and in the shop history widget, I want to prove that this shop view model is only accessible on .shop page and not on the history page. So how can I do that? Well, you just have to call the way you do registration for your cart view model. So in this case, like you can just simply shop view model. So again, this should return an error because the shop view model is not provided. It's not provided for shop history, but rather for shop page only. Shop view model. So this is probably one of the common mistakes that developers encounter if they're trying to access something that is not provided on that specific page. So for this one, if we try to visit this page, there should be an error, but don't be afraid, don't be scared of this error. One of the beautiful things that I love about Provider is that it provides you this very detailed error that maybe, make sure, this shop view model is actually under the shop or is actually provided for shop history. So that's kind of one of the beautiful things that I like about Provider. It provides a very detailed error. And again, what we prove here is that if we only provide the shop view model for the shop page, you should not be able to access it on the shop history page. At the same time, if you're trying to access shop history page on the shop page, you cannot access it as well. So vice versa. So as long as it's provided for its own purpose, they should not be accessed on other feature scope. Last but not least is we need to identify some practical examples how we can share state across multiple features. So let me just delete this function. Okay, let me just try to add. So as you can see here earlier, we have the changing cart item here. So right now, I remove it so we can actually see how it changes over time. So step 2. So right now, we have added change me. Okay, we have the change me text so that you guys can see it as well here. Okay, it does nothing, but if we try to change something here, as you can see here, it changes, right? From the disabled state to an enabled state. But to prove that this is actually changing, we can do something like what we do on a counteract, which is we subscribe to a value. So this, we can actually do something like this, like shop count. We can subscribe to this one, cart count. And as you can see here, it just adds a series of numbers, right? So as much as possible, in trying to separate the business logic concern of your application, try to move all the logic, really, all the logic to the business or the review model of your app. So in this one, as you can see here, I'm just trying to replace this cart count to string with cart label. So let's see what this cart label does. As you can see here, like it counts and also changes. It's kind of like has this special string that changes the cart item. So instead of doing something like this, cart counter cart instead of doing something like this, which is almost similar in many ways, which actually is similar in many ways. You can see here, like it's very similar. The problem here is that you are probably, if this is just a simple example, right? But what if you have a different way of identifying things? Like for example, you have some computations on top of the things that you're trying to display. And you may want to separate that computation as well to the business logic or to the view model of your application. If you try to enter cart label here, this has this operation that if the cart count is empty, so no, instead of actually doing something like this is actually acceptable, but if you want to really have to separate all of the concerns of this logic, then you can do something like this. Like if it's just a simple getter of the function and it does all the logic. And the good thing here, since it is part of the cart view model, you can test it like separately from the UI, which is a good thing. So now you can create tests for this provider class that has to, it's almost similar on how you would actually see it on a real app. So if it's the cart count is 0, then I should be able to write a unit test that shows a text cart is empty. Otherwise, it shows the cart view value that is actually be changing. See that? So it's actually changing. So you can also do something like a bit more complex. For example, if you want to add some item in the cart, so you can have some sort of algorithm that allows you to separate. So right now it's not just counting the app by the number of items, it's also categorizing the items. So in a complex application, there be a lot more, right? So this is just probably one of the simplest algorithms that you can do to categorize. So if the cart is there, you should just increment the item. If the cart is not there, create the cart with the initial item count. So and so on and so forth. Like you would not want to add this on the widget or the UI because you will be having a hard time to actually write tests for this. And that's about it. Like echoing the best state management, really, like there's no single or one best state management. Just really have to identify what you need. For example, you have this short timeline, you have this very complex or simple project. Choose what is most appropriate. But if you cannot choose, like just use provider if you're not sure really what to use. Choose what works best for your team. So you're not the only developer, especially if you're working in the industry. So try to prove or reason appropriately technically with your team that this is what you want, this is what will work best for your project as you deem it. And as always, just be open. Try out new tools whenever possible, and if you have time, play around with it. Because you will not be able to understand how Block, how Redux, how Mobix works if you haven't really tried them firsthand, right? So even if there are documentations for provider, Mobix, if you're not aware or actually don't have the firsthand experience trying those, it will be difficult to reason out to your teams. And if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. Keep fluttering. Right, so that's about it. We have one question, for complex application, do you think Block is more appropriate or suitable to provider? Definitely, if it's really a complex object, if you're talking about something like 20 or 100 screens, using an architecture and a design data modeling for your app, it actually helps a lot on introducing a lot more features in the future. But again, like provider is not first-hand built just for the sake of becoming a state management tool. Provider is a mixture of it's a mixture between DI and state management. But uh, for immediate use case, that provider really has this like capability to help you build a real application, especially if it's just simple or medium applications. Because if you're just new to Flutter and you're trying to understand how block works, I think that will take up too much of your time rather than building your app alone. Okay, so just now, when you Shop View model was not available on history page and vice versa, what do you mean exactly? So what we mean exactly on that one is that if we provide shop view model, meaning like if we try to go back in this example, if we only provide the instance of the shop view model on for shop page and it's not provided like on the top root, no top or root widget tree, this value, the shop view model, is only accessible. So it's only accessible to this shop page. So this is the shop page, and this is the history page. So if we only provided the shop view model here, we will not be able to listen. We will not be able to call or overall use the instance of the shop view model because it's only provided here. And as you can see here, it's a sibling, meaning they lie adjacent to each other, and it's not shop history is not a child of shop in any way. So meaning in the widget tree, they are considered siblings. So as you can see here, shop view model can be accessed within shop and down the widget tree. So if you try to access shop view model in dashboard, you will receive an error. At the same time, other view models that are not provided in the root widget tree, they cannot be used like globally in your app. So that's how we do feature scope providing. So hope that answers your question. Can one model be provided to multiple children? Yes, definitely. Like you can provide a series of model to multiple children, just like how we did it on the root page. Like it can have multiple pages. Definitely, you can. Do you recommend getX in a complex program? Um, Personally, like I don't use getX. Like I don't have against about it, but yeah, I don't use getX because at least for me, like this is just my personal opinion. This is not based on our community or other else's opinion. Like I see MobX as it tries to abstract some of the things that you would probably doing, especially in state management on your own. So I think for beginners, I think it's a bit difficult if you're not familiar on how state management works and you're trying to use something like a package like getX. But again, I have no against getX, but I'm just trying to bring my point here. As a beginner, if I try to use getX, for example, it will be difficult for someone or for me not to track the bugs or the issues. At least that's how I see it, because it abstracts all of the efforts from you or from a developer, from me, all of us, to implement state management from scratch and other things. It's just kind of like a toolkit for on top of Flutter. So at least that's my opinion, but no, again, getters have been applauded by a lot of people in the community, and no, it's just that we have to be open. No, we can use it. Maybe sometimes we not. And yeah, that's my answer for your question. Yeah, if you guys still have questions, like yeah, I'm open to answer them. Yes, hopefully you guys learned like state management like in a nutshell. Like there's more to it, but like I don't want to bombard you with a lot of information, and hopefully we'll get to see each other soon and on the next ones, or at least in the future. And excited for your apps. If you guys manage to build one, excited for it. All right, yeah, let me know if there's still any question. Okay, there's a question. Do you recommend working directly with Firebase or building an API to move through? This is really a subjective question to the teams, right? So I think this depends on a lot of factors and use cases. So is real-time database is really one of your concerns. I don't think it's recommended like for you to create something from scratch, especially if you're opting to for the real-time database. And Firebase actually works great on its own. It's best. Although it depends on really on the situation. There are instances from my experience. So way back when I was still in a very heavily regulated, I'm building a heavily regulated application. So this specific institute, one of the biggest telcos in the Philippines, requires us to build an application and requires to whitelist some specific servers. At the time, we can't just whitelist Firebase, or at least they can't just whitelist Firebase. So there's a specific issue there. So we opted to build our own API. But no, if it really depends on a lot of factors. It just so happens that most of my projects is under a heavily regulated industry, and they are just really wanting to build everything from scratch. So right now I'm working on the banking industry. Previously, I'm working on an application related to live streaming. So it's the live streaming. We use custom servers for that one as well. Other than that, I've also worked on a crypto-based application. So it's really regulated as well. Yeah, let me know if you guys still have questions. What's the difference between provider and a stream provider? Well, like the only difference is that instead of you trying to like just use the plain old provider and handle all the streams yourself, the stream provider is built for you to be able to subscribe to specific streams. For example, whether a WebSocket, whether an open connection to the server that you're trying to connect to, and with that, you can just simply add a child widget on that one, then it automatically renders that specific widget. So the only difference is that the stream provider is built for network calls or business logic that has to deal with streams. So streams in Flutter. So I think one of the most common use case why we use stream provider, I think before is based on the chat. So if you're building a chat application, a stream is something like, for example, it can connect as well to some sort of like WebSocket, then it could just simply stay open and re-render the child widgets or descendants of that specific provider. All right, no worries. Like, feel free to ask. Like, not sure when. Yeah, feel free to ask. Is there was a JP token? Oh, this is really a tricky one. So, the values in provider, especially the typical variables that we have in a Flutter app, are all stored in the memory. So whether you have a counter app or counter value in the home screen, and the provider class, they are all in the memory. So JW token, if you're speaking of a JW token that is dealing with the authentication, and these having this stored in the memory exposes some security vulnerability. So I often recommend if you can store it in this package, the Flutter Secure Storage, that one. So at least for that case, you are at least certain that your app is the only one retrieving it from your device. So especially in Android, like you can actually read. If you're good at it, you can read what are the values that are being stored in the memory of a device. So as much as possible, like sensitive data, info, they can be stored in a secure or persistent storage that is encrypted. So this can also be a SQLite that is encrypted, but not in the memory or simple variable. But what you can do though is that JWT token, you can expose a function. So for example, a function that is almost similar to this, get token from secure storage. So you can do something like this, right? So instead of actually storing the value inside the class, inside the variable, you can store it in a secure storage, and that method gets a token from secure storage can retrieve it for you. So that way it's a bit more secure rather than on memory. Yeah, feel free to ask if you guys have any question, but if not, I'm leaving my email here. If you're shy to ask your question, I always try to make time, at least every week, to answer some of your concerns. Or just last 2 weeks I'm off there, so right now I'm back on track. How's everything so far, man? Daniel, Nadia?
Yeah, Joshua. Just one more question, I think. Yeah, since everyone not asking anything, so I was wondering, is there any tips for example, me, I really never worked with a provider before. So is there any tips for those who are like just starting to get into using state management tools?
All right, at least for that one, actually you don't really have to start with provider. If you're new to Flutter, but you can just simply use set state, or just simple scope model. But in terms of asking some tips, if you're just new to provider, just really start small. Like I can give you the project. You can look at it, the source code, and it's just simple. You don't have to over-engineer things. You just have to build something. I think learning by experience or actually trying really helps a lot, because right now I presented some of the theory concepts of provider, but since we don't have enough time to discuss everything practically, it really comes down to actually trying it. So for example, you can start with converting a counter app to provider. You can follow the steps that we've had, and from there, you'll have this kind of satisfaction that, oh, I already actually succeeded, converting a counter app to provider. So maybe I can actually do something else more complex. So just start small. That's my tip.
All right, I see. Okay, so do anyone of the audience have any more questions?
Sure. I can share it. I think, let me just share. Actually been away from GitHub for a while, but let me check. Right now, this is the repository where things are removed, but I'll push the ones that actually work. So this one, we share it with here. So this actually built 24 days ago before Christmas break. All right. I think there are 2 commits there. So the first commit is the one that is actually working. The for demo, the commit is that I deleted stuff there. You can just switch the commits. I'm curious, is this recorded as well? Maybe you guys can re-watch it or somehow if you have questions.
Yeah, this session is recorded.
Right. I'm curious, how is it currently being recorded? OBS something or screen recording?
Yeah.
Right. Right. Because I don't see any Google Meet recorded. That works fine as well. Right.
Right. Any more questions from the audience?
You can also ask me questions anything from Flutter, not related provider. If there's 2 Tech 99. Okay. All right. Feel free to reach out to my email if you guys have questions. What is the usage of key besides scaffold? Well, there are a lot of use cases of key, but one use case that is very obvious for a key is that when the widgets are of the same types, for example, imagine you have a row or a column of, say, text, and you want to reorder them programmatically, you can use keys for that one. Imagine just playing around with the keys, you can switch the order between the things that is part of that specific widget, especially if they are of the same type. Other use cases for a key is that you can use it heavily on testing widgets and integration testing. So there is a specific part of integration testing where you can automate the things in Flutter apps. For example, you have a counter app that automatically clicks the plus button. You can assign a specific key on that button, and you can programmatically call it. So for example, you can tap this specific key. So this key should be unique. So tap this specific key, and after tapping specific key, I should be able to have, for example, if I tap it 3 times, this specific key, I should be able to have a counter text, which is equivalent to 3. So there are a lot of use cases, but most commonly we use it for reordering widgets that are of different types, or like working with widgets that are of the same type. You can distinguish them by keys, and especially in test. The next one is testing. Yeah, the ones that you mentioned for scaffold is for global state mainly. Yeah, if you want to access the context on a different level of your apps, for example, on a snack bar, dialogue. Yeah, not sure really like what's. Let me check. Not sure what ONWH means, but yeah. I hope that helps. Yeah, oftentimes like you don't have to deal with the keys you're on your own. Like this is automatically assigned by the framework.
Yeah. On the side note, for those who are who really not asking anything or wish to, I mean not wish, those who have like free time, feel free to fill in the feedback form for this session. We really appreciate your any feedbacks. Yeah, so yeah, feel free to fill in our feedback form. Yeah, right.
Well, I appreciate it as well. Like hopefully you learn a lot. Not sure. I'm excited for your journey. Okay, is there any way to prevent the widget rebuilding screen 2 every time it presses back? Rebuilding widget 2 every time. Well, depending on how you plan to do it, but if you're doing something like that, like there's no really other way, because like I assume you're using push replacement. If you're switching from or either push or push name, that will constitute a rebuild, or wait, okay, so that will constitute to a rebuild really. Like if you don't want to rebuild screen 2, you can do something like adding them in a page view, and if they are already in a page view, they can be, you can actually do something like keep alive mixin, automatic keep alive mixin. So we actually have that in the source code. So as you can see here, we have shop view. So there's a specific method. So every time this, switching between shop and shop history, like they actually don't change. It's just that they maintain their state. So as long as the parent widget right now, which is the dashboard, is alive, right? For that case, like you can just actually persist, things that you want to be stored on a provider. Like that actually helps, or even on another state management like block, you can actually add them there so that the next time you try to open your chat, they are now already preloaded. As in the data are now in provider, and if you try to open the chat page, then they should be available from that point. Yeah, I think probably one of the things that you're doing is you're calling the API again in the chat page. I guess for that one, you can actually just create a shared instance between the 2 pages.
Another side question is totally not related with this session, but then I was wondering how's your journey? I mean, you've clearly been working a lot with Flutter. How's your journey with not just learning Flutter, but doing everything in Flutter?
Right, that's really an interesting question. Like, we also do some side projects like for web, Python, but like my journey so far in the Flutter is that it gave me a job. Before I was actually working as a native developer for iOS and Android for one of the biggest freelancing platforms in the world. Right now I'm working for a banking company, for a startup, or fintech company. So it's been an awesome journey so far. Like, you're using this tool that improves the developer productivity. I think that's one of the things that I really like about Flutter. And instead of actually, declarative means, I think you guys are aware that Flutter is declarative. So it means that it actually helps you think what your app would look like by just looking at the code. So you're just writing on your own how the button would look like. I think that really improves the teams, or at least my personal developer productivity on how I develop things. Yeah, at least in Flutter. Other than that, like my journey so far, like yeah, Flutter is not that really used here in the Philippines. We're actually just I think just under a year trying to build a community around it. So hopefully, like most of the companies that are currently using React or are native will give a try on how Flutter works, because that's how technology works. You just really have to be open. Otherwise, you'll not be able to try out other adventures. Yeah, so far it's been fun and an amazing experience learning Flutter and using Flutter for my day-to-day work. Yes. What normally use transfer data from one page to another? It really depends. Like there are instances where you have to use push named. So for the push named, you really have to use arguments. But if you're not using push name because you're probably using the push, like just the push and passing the material page route, then you'll probably ending up using, the constructors, at least for that one. That's really one of the options. But there's actually a new way of routing in Flutter, the navigation 2.0. But hopefully, I think I do not. So far, it will be a lot difficult for the beginners to try the Navigator 2.0. But at least for the existing navigation that we have, yeah, like it really depends on the use case. Because push name is not probably the only imperative method that you will use for navigation. There are times where you have to use push. So for example, you want a different transition. So for example, you want to transition from homepage to chat screen. Instead of opening it from, like a typical Cupertino, because this is the global settings that you have, you can specify animations or transitions specifically if you are passing it using material page route. Is there any other alternative to this between push name and constructors? Well, you can actually always use shared instance in provider. Definitely, you can use it, but oftentimes, like like the data. If the data is just going to be used within a specific feature, within a specific screen, what's the point of sharing it within two specific classes? But on top of that, like that's really the only way you can do it so far. How do we extract Flutter app to be deployed on iOS devices like without connecting to the host computer? At least for that one, like you can use Code Magic. So Code Magic or Mac in the cloud. So if everything goes well, in your app, like if it works well on Android because you only have Android, then hopefully you don't have any specific errors for iOS, then you can use Code Magic. So you can also actually build the pipeline of your app, then it automatically builds and deploys the app for you. Just have to set up all the keys and keychains on the interface of Code Magic. And also you can use Mac in the cloud. So Mac in the cloud is using like a remote PC. So it's a remote PC that you can use inside your laptop again, but it's hosted on the cloud. So the GPUs, the CPUs are not using yours, but hopefully you have a good internet connection if you're doing that. Yeah, APK is not possible for iOS device. iOS or the platform itself, it's very secure. It's not open source. You cannot create tools with regards to packages. On top of that, aside from Fastlane, but yeah, unlike Android, it has APK. What is your opinion about Kotlin? Sorry, I just read it. Yeah, I actually use Kotlin for my full-time job, like for my previous company. It's actually great. Like Kotlin on its own is a great language. It's very simple. It's very concise. Anyone can actually learn it. I think easier than a Dart. But like there are times where you have to, really consider the business. I think in the end, like we're actually building apps for businesses and for our own good. But if it's really for a business perspective, like currently at the time that we started a project, multi-project, Kotlin multi-platform is not that stable. But using Kotlin for Android, it's really the best and currently the standard right now in terms of like building Android apps. So I have nothing against it. I love Kotlin, both Flutter, and I still build some apps in Kotlin times. It's just that the concept that we've discussed today, really the state management, it's kind of like the rationale between choosing the best one. You can actually apply it on Android as well in iOS. So it's very generally, at least a theory one. All right, guess we are, yeah.
Yeah.
Not sure.
Yeah. Thanks for the all your
No
responses.
worries.
Yeah. So if there's no more question, I guess we can end this here. And yeah, we definitely appreciate your presence here, giving us help on the provided state management. One more question.
Okay, like what's your question? Like I'm happy to answer it. Yeah, depends on what you're trying to store. Like if it's cookies, you will have to use Cookie Manager. If it's a typical token, like you can just use this one. Like I really recommend just using this one. Like all the way for security stuff, like sensitive data. Feel free to use this package. Like it really helps a lot.
All right. On that note, so again, thank you for thank you for your all your responses and also your wonderful speech. I totally learned a lot of stuff. So thank you for coming to this session.
No worries.
Thank you all for coming. And also again once again, thank you, Joshua, for this wonderful session. And
all right. Thanks everyone, and hope you guys like, stay safe like always. Like just take care of yourself.